Hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Moore, and I serve as the Director of Formation and the Program Director for the ECHO program at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. I'm very happy to welcome all of you here to this week's session in our summer series entitled Co-Responsibility and Cultivating Cultures of Belonging. Thank you all very much for joining us. And as a roadmap for this afternoon's session, Dr. John Cavadini will offer a few words. I will have a conversation with each of our two panelists on their inspiring work, and we'll conclude with your questions and comments. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. John Cavadini, Professor of Theology at Notre Dame and Director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. You will recognize him from previous sessions in our summer series. Dr. Cavadini will be our guide as we consider the theology of co-responsibility and cultivating cultures of belonging. John, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you. Friends, it's nice to see you again. Colleen asked me if I would give a little presentation at the beginning, maybe connecting this idea of co-responsibility to to cultivating a culture of belonging in the church. So I've tried to do that. This is, as everything we're doing in this seminar is exploratory. There is nothing offered here that is really, in my presentation, that's definitive or prescriptive. I'm trying to ignite a culture of thinking about co-responsibility, I guess. And so I'm trying to feed ideas out there, and hopefully some of them will be useful in your own thinking. So if I succeed in generating some thinking about this, I think I will have succeeded. So friends, in the spirit of exploration, I have what I'm calling 6 mini points that invite exploration. And they don't look like mini points, but they actually are. So here's the first one. When we talk about belonging in the church, so we're not talking about belonging to an ordinary club or something like that, like the Elks Club or some kind of club that we make. So when we talk about belonging in the church, we have to keep our emphasis on what the language of belonging means, where it comes from, or how it's used in the church. And the first point is the context for the use of the language of belonging in the church, I'd like to suggest is baptismal. Just like the context for thinking about co-responsibility comes from the baptismal priesthood. So the context for the use of the language of belonging is baptismal. And here's some passages that illustrate what I mean. They're from the Catechism. The baptism have become living stones to be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood. By baptism, they share in the priesthood of Christ in his prophetic and royal mission. Even that image of our being part of a spiritual house is already a kind of, if there's hospitality involved here in belonging, it has to be part of being incorporated into or welcomed into the spiritual house, it seems to me. Having become a member of the church, the person baptized belongs no longer to him or herself, but to him who died and rose for us. It seems to me that's the primary passage I want to point out to. Baptism makes it so we don't belong to ourselves anymore. We belong to Jesus. And therefore, Ephesians says, we are members one of another. So these are all passages quoted in the Catechism. So it's not like belonging to a club. It's that through baptism, we no longer belong to ourselves. We belong to Jesus, and we belong to each other in him. So in a sense, we don't belong to a thing called the church. We do, but belonging to the church means not belonging to ourselves and being in a communion of not belonging to ourselves, but belonging to Jesus and in him to each other. And the context mini point number 2, the context for the use of the language of belonging in the church is also Eucharistic. since baptism anyway is ordered towards the Eucharist. So here's a little quote for that. Believers who respond to God's word and become members of Christ's body become intimately united with him. This is especially true of baptism, which unites us to Christ's death and resurrection, and the Eucharist, by which, really sharing in the body of the Lord, we are taken up into communion with him and with one another. That's 790 in the Catechism, citing Lumen Gentium 7, which I'm sure you recognize. So once again, belonging in the church is not like belonging to a club. It's not like belonging to something we make and we're trying to get people to become part of our thing. What we're doing, we have to be conscious of the primary belonging into the church is not to ourselves, actually, and not to something we make, but to Christ, and in him to each other. And we certainly don't make each other. Can everybody see the handout? There's a message in the chat room saying they don't see the handout. It is there, I'm assured. Okay, so this means point number 3, the culture of belonging in the church, I want to suggest, is first and foremost, therefore, the sacramental culture of the church, the baptismal and Eucharistic culture of not belonging to ourselves, but rather to him who died and rose for us, and in him to each other and not to ourselves. So, in a way, if we're belonging to Jesus, we're belonging to someone who doesn't belong to himself either, right? Because he gives himself always to the Father. And so it's a communion and not belonging to ourselves in someone who doesn't belong to himself. And thereby, we're open to and become members of each other. We belong to each other. So in a sense, the gift of being in the church is that we're given to each other in a new way, not based on our similarities or our preferences or our likes or our dislikes, not based on any kind of ownership we want to claim over the church itself, but in the sacramental life of the church, rather than in any belonging we create in the first instance. So we're not trying to get somebody to belong to our thing. We're trying to encourage, persuade, mediate, deepen a sense of being in a communion where precisely we don't belong to ourselves, and in belonging to him, we belong to each other beyond our personal preferences, our achievements, our whatever. So then number 4, a sense of co-responsibility, to bring it back to our theme, for this culture would mean taking responsibility to build up this sacramental culture in the church. And everything that flows from it or leads to it, which really is evangelization understood as leading people to communion in belonging not to ourselves, but to him, and in him to each other. I think it's important to preserve this sense that when we talk about ecclesial belonging, we're not trying to get somebody to belong to something we belong to because we belong to it, like it's a club. But instead, to invite people to take the lead in inviting people into a communion which precisely does not belong to us and is not even in us in the first place. And so then in point number 5, mini point number 5, what it would mean then, it seems to me, to think about co-responsibility for belonging, for ecclesial belonging, mean taking leadership in some way, in ways large or small, in cultivating a yearning to belong intimately to Jesus Christ. Not to belong to my thing, but to belong to Jesus Christ, or to cultivate a gratitude for belonging already, if you do, a deepening gratitude, or to cultivate a deeper understanding of what it means, either to help people to enter the church or help people to come back if it seems like the church has somehow died in their hearts. So it means directing attention to Jesus and to communion in him. And I think people are put off by what Pope Francis calls proselytizing, which I think means directing attention to the church because I belong to it. It's my team, and I want you to be on my team. Instead of it's not mine at all, and it's not even my belonging to myself, but my belonging to him and to each other in him. And to make that ideal come alive for people, I guess, in all kinds of various ways. And then, although on the handout it might look forbidding because I have subpoints A through G, these are only passages from Pope Francis. I wanted to give you some little roots, I guess, ideas or anchors in Pope Francis's first apostolic exhortation, which is Evangelii Gaudium, which I almost take as a kind of roadmap for co-responsibility in evangelization. So these are just points from Pope Francis, further invitations to think about this. A, in your heart, you know it is not the same to live without him. What you have come to realize, what has helped you to live and given you hope, is what you also need to communicate to others. So in some way, we know the difference that Jesus makes, that belonging to him makes. And I think evangelization would be helping people to understand or to see that difference as we have experienced it, not because we've experienced it, but because talking about it could lead someone to seeking out that experience, or to maybe thinking about recovering it again, coming back. Anyone who has truly experienced God's saving love, Pope Francis says, does not need much time or lengthy training to go out and proclaim that love. Every Christian is a missionary to the extent that he or she has encountered the love of God in Jesus Christ. So he's saying to have confidence, to be able to share this love and to try to, you might say, help other people to find it so that they can decide to belong to him and thus to each other in him. That doesn't mean that it doesn't help to have, training and formation. But I think that the role of training and formation is so that we can provide leadership that helps other people who don't have it do what Pope Francis says right here, to be a resource for them. C, there's a kind of preaching which falls to each of us as a daily responsibility. I highlighted the word responsibility myself because it goes with co-responsibility. Informal, unexpectedly, and in any place, on the street, in a city square, during work, on a journey, and I would add any program or project that helps people to think about this. That's my addition. Where we share this love in ways that occur to us, or as the Spirit guides us, not in haranguing ways, in ways that create intimacy rather than create distance. And I think that's exercising co-responsibility. There's levels of it. You can take responsibility for projects that help people to do this. That's leadership. God has found a way to unite himself to every human being in every age. He has chosen to call them together as a people and not as isolated individuals. Pope Francis referring to Lumen Gentium. This people which God has chosen and called is the church. To those who feel far from God and the church, to all those who are fearful or indifferent, I would like to say this: the Lord, with great respect and love, is also calling you to be a part of his people. So there's calling you to belong, not to belong to the person who's speaking to you, the evangelizer, As the evangelizer, our job is to direct people towards ecclesial communion in the way that Pope Francis says, precisely to those who feel far, or to those who are fearful, or to those who are indifferent. These are dimensions of hospitality which come from the heart of the evangelizer. You don't have to, maybe the institutional church is cold sometimes. Okay, let it be, but you're not, we're not. And it's our responsibility too, and we can create these little cultures of warmth, I think, of attraction, of encouragement to people to belong to him and thereby to each other. Also through enculturation, the church introduces peoples together with their cultures into her own community. Enculturation is a big part of feeling like you belong. And so leadership in enculturation is leadership in welcoming and in belonging, not to ourselves, but to him. So we don't say our culture is the only one, and therefore you have to belong to it to belong to him. Pope Francis cautions against the failure of institutions to be welcoming, including, he says, the welcoming of popular devotional life, which ties to last week's topic. Let us not stifle or presume to control this missionary power, that of popular devotional life, because it's one level of belonging to the culture flowing from the sacraments and of ordering people back towards them. It's kind of, like I tried to say last week, a low status level. People have to maybe start belonging like by putting their feet in at the shallow end of the pool, as it were. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Participating in these devotions is a way of participating in the sacramental culture of the church, or the culture that flows from the sacramental culture. So let's leave all of these doorways and these levels open. The preferential option for the poor, finally, is the practice of not belonging to ourselves, such that in every Christian community, the poor feel at home, Pope Francis. Without the preferential option for the poor, Pope Francis says, the proclamation of the gospel, which is itself the prime form of charity, notice that, evangelization, risks being misunderstood or submerged by the ocean of words in today's society of mass communications. As a tiny footnote to that, I think that includes mass communications intended to be part of evangelization, because sometimes the mass communications become a culture of themselves and a kind of elitist culture, which almost seems to shut out belonging or invitation to belonging. I think we have to be careful that the medium of mass communication doesn't obscure the message by being the message, and actually get in the way of the conviction in our heart that it's person-to-person sharing, directing people towards communion in the church, not necessarily, though I'm a theologian, towards intellectual arguments. They're a part of it, but that's not finally what generates a sense of belonging. And I'm a theologian saying that. So number 6, the last mini point. These are just all suggestions from Pope Francis that I'm kind of floating here to put some life into this instead of the boring professor. So what this also means, that is, taking co-responsibility for a sense of belonging means trying to do everything to deepen a sense of communion, bring people to communion, bring people back. It also means not trying to replace the sacramental culture of belonging with belonging we create. So subgroups in the church that cultivate loyalty to the subgroup at the expense of the sense of the sacramental life of the church, of that culture of belonging which is belonging to him and each other through him. Or a hospitality which seems to try to make up for the supposedly less engaging sacramental life of the church. A lot of times people say the evangelical churches, for example, are more hospitable. Well, on one level it's true, but I think having coffee shops and everything in church is, in a sense, if you don't have the sacramental life, if you don't have that much deeper culture of communion in him and through him in each other, a communion which he creates and we don't, a belonging which he creates and we don't, but try to seize that culture for ourselves. There's a way in which you can actually deflect people away from the true culture of belonging, because they're going to always be looking for, I don't know, that instant sense of hospitality, which I'm not against hospitality, but we have to remember we can't use our hospitality to replace one we don't create. And being a member of the sacramental life, of the sacramental culture, the sacramental communion is not the same as a superficial sense of welcoming, which seems to substitute for it or make up for it. I'm not sure how quite to put that. I'm not saying we shouldn't be welcoming. Pope Francis says we should, but we have to be careful not to substitute that culture of, I don't know, superficial hospitality for the one in which we're living stones, members of a spiritual house, and as such, truly belonging to each other in a belonging which we didn't give ourselves, the belonging to Christ, which we received through the sacraments. Okay, friends, those are my points. They're just out there for reflection. There might be questions about them. I'm happy to answer either now or by email.
Thank you very much, John. And we'll also have time at the end for questions for our two panelists as well as John. So thank you for your many points. I think they're not, the ideas that they express are not so many. So I think there's a lot there for us to dwell in. And I think it tees us up well to pivot to our panelists. Thanks so much, John, as well, for highlighting Evangelii Gaudium. There's a phrase from Pope Francis's writing there that you've also used in helping expand the laity and the ordained imagination for what co-responsibility can look like within the life of the church, and reminding us that in virtue of our baptism, all the baptized, whatever our position in the church or level of instruction in the faith, are agents of evangelization, as you alluded to, of guiding people to an encounter with Christ that opens and changes hearts. And I think that our two panelists, in their own particular way, are models of that. And we invite them here today, not necessarily to highlight the work that they've done as something that can and should be picked up and transported and kind of dropped down, but more as a witness to how they came about and how they fed the communities in which they emerged, and also to see the dispositions of those who I think have either knowingly or not taken up this call to co-responsibility for the life of the church. So first, I'd like to introduce Madeline Infantine. She served as a McGrath Church Life intern during her senior year at Notre Dame some years ago. She has since received her MFA in poetry from Miami University, and she's currently pursuing an MTS degree at Boston College. Welcome, Madeline, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, Madeline, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about Stories of Grace, something that you created some years ago back as a student at Notre Dame, which continues to this day. So what is Stories of Grace and how did it come to be?
Sure. So my first encounter with Stories of Grace was back in 2011, and that was when Stories of Grace was as a component of the Notre Dame Vision program, which I know a lot of people gathered here today are really familiar with. But I was a high schooler and I attended Notre Dame Vision for a very grace-filled week after my sophomore year. A week at Notre Dame Vision is full of a lot of moments of prayer and conversation and reflection. But what really like stuck the most for me as a high schooler was hearing the college mentors in faith stand up on the stage of DeBartolo and share stories of grace. And these were witness talks where the college students were articulating the movement of grace at work in their lives. And I was just so like wide-eyed at their stories, and I felt my own perception transforming too. I had never really been invited before to think about how grace was at work in my own life. So I think that I started to understand this, the power of that invitation again in a very real way the summer after my freshman year of college at Notre Dame, when I got to become a college mentor for M.Div myself. And that was a huge gift to spend 2 summers as a mentor of faith, that summer after my freshman year and then again after my junior year. And both those times I was invited to share a story of grace myself. So I started to hold on to, I think, this kind of like quiet hope that storytelling and thinking about how we can articulate grace for others could be something I thought about more than just a few summer weeks as a mentor in faith. And my coursework sort of began to reflect that little seed that had been planted when I was a high schooler as well. I was an English and theology major, and I was really eager to make connections between like the grace that we receive and then the stories that we tell. So for me, grace was really at work when Lenny DiLorenzo invited me to be a part of the inaugural cohort of McGrath Church Life interns. And the position came with the invitation to spend my senior year thinking about how stories of grace could help foster beauty in the life of the church. So it was really this invitation to like step into the space of this growing seed that had been planted all the way back when I was like filled with wonder, sitting on the edge of my seat at the front row of DeBartolo Hall at Notre Dame Vision. Through this internship, I got to work on creating a new space for stories of grace to be shared. So mentors would share their stories with a high school audience at M.Div each summer, but the idea was to offer a space in which storytellers could invite friends and classmates from their respective pockets of campus to hear their stories. So we came up with this monthly evening of prayer and reflection that would be centered around 3 stories of grace. And for those stories of grace nights, 2 stories came from mentors who would have previously shared their story at Notre Dame Vision. And then one story would come from a Notre Dame faculty or staff member, and they would write their story newly for the occasion. So once a month for about 45 minutes, we would gather in the Geddes Hall Chapel, and we would listen to our 3 storytellers, and then we would close the evening by praying evening prayer together. So that was the Stories of Grace evening.
Yeah, thank you for kind of walking us through the development of that. It strikes me, as John was kind of saying, that the threshold to entry and was lowered by the kind of general invitation that was offered to so many to gather. How did you find that this played out? Gathering folks to share a story of grace, but also to hear stories of grace. How did you find, who did this draw, and how did it gather people?
Yeah, that's a great question. The goal for the Stories of Grace nights was to create a space for the storytellers to share stories for a new audience, for people to be invited to hear these stories who might not have had that kind of invitation placed before them in quite that way before. So our intention wasn't necessarily for Geddes Chapel to be filled like exclusively with former M.Div mentors in faith, or like even with theology majors. My hope was that sharing those sharing stories would really be able to invite people from their dorms or classes. So maybe like a storyteller on hall staff would be able to invite their freshman resident, or like a storyteller in the band would invite the whole trombone section. So that was a really important element that we wanted to attend to, that someone who might not be familiar with the space M.Div vision mentors occupy on campus, or maybe wouldn't find themselves at a campus ministry retreat, or would be wandering down to dorm mass, would feel really welcome there. So in planning the nights, each monthly night featured that set of 3 storytellers, and we designed it to sort of call out to different pockets of campus. So different dorms, different majors, and different extracurricular spaces. And like you said, perhaps each listener came because they knew the storyteller personally, and perhaps it started that way. But I think when they arrived, they were put in this realm where it could become something more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that, as kind of alluding to what John was setting up there. We know that within parishes, within schools, within universities, despite maybe our best intentions, groups can kind of congregate around their own sense of belonging to a particular group, and groups of faith are not immune to that. And we know that sometimes part of that invitation that can draw someone in who might not be interested in an invitation to engage directly in the sacramental life. But it just strikes me that what you were drawing people in by is what they did know that they cared about, which is to hear stories of grace of those whom they know. And it strikes me as just a beautiful invitation, and that you chose to do it in the context of prayer as well. Another, a participant may not have been drawn in by an invitation to prayer, but by an invitation to come to know their classmate better. But it didn't stop there. You offered something that pointed not just to the stories, right? Because our culture does value storytelling, and that's a beautiful thing. But at the same time, it sounds like the environment that you created didn't point back to the stories themselves, but pointed to the source of those stories, the source of that grace, and thereby pointed the participants, whatever their reason for coming, to the source of that grace as well. So I think that illustrates really well kind of the point that John was making. I guess lastly, because I do want this to empower those of us who kind of think, we've used the example in these sessions of co-responsibility, maybe in the example of the great Dorothy Day, who created a movement that still exists today in so many parts of our country, and serves the church beautifully. I think a lot of us maybe don't see ourselves as capable of starting something like that, and don't have the imagination for what it is we might be co-responsible for. So I just want to ask you, where did you, get the courage to kind of identify this, and then not just keep it to yourself, but think that it might be an invitation that might be worth sharing with others?
That's a really good question, because I vividly remember setting up for our first monthly evening service, and my hands were shaking so badly as I was placing a few little candles in the nooks of the stained glass windows in that chapel, and I had this fear that nobody was going to come, nobody was going to show up, because the invitation to host these Stories of Grace nights really invited me to reimagine how I could relate to these stories of grace that I had always loved so dearly. And I still sort of felt like that high schooler in the audience, and that there was no way I could be standing and hosting and inviting these storytellers to share. But I think for me, the courage in part at the beginning just came from having such a powerful experience myself, listening to stories of grace and knowing that it is a space in which we get to practice vulnerability and attention to each other, and I know I knew that was a powerful space. But as the nights continued, something else that gave me courage was hearing like little rivulets of change that would come out of these stories of grace nights. So like hearing from an RA who invited her residents to hear her story that a few weeks later they had started talking about faith one night in the dorm for the first time, or hearing a storyteller mention that a friend they had invited, that they had discovered that they had like a mutual understanding of an experience of grief that they had never talked about before. And hearing that the night was not necessarily leaving those who gathered the same way after they gathered, that gave me the courage to know that this thing that I was longing for was something that others longed for too.
That's really beautiful, Madeline. Thank you for that. And I think we'd be remiss to say, because I noticed some of you, you know, are commenting about kind of the sacramental life kind of gives way to our ability to invite others in. And I think the Stories of Grace was born out of a community that celebrated the sacramental life together. And yet it didn't stop there. It wasn't satisfied with, isn't this lovely for ourselves? It was everyone has a story of grace to share and can learn how to share it. And others may be interested in it. And I just love your examples of, you know, people coming to support a friend, perhaps was their motivation, but leaving with a seed of something much deeper planted there. So just thank you for the courage to propose the project that you did. And all these years later, it's still going. And so many have had the privilege of being a part of it. So many stories of grace have been told. And when I think about your project not being created, those stories of grace existed, but they were not being shared. So you gave them a platform in which to be shared, and other seeds to kind of be sprinkled among the community as well. So thank you very much, Madeline. I hope we can all kind of take inspiration from that too, of the ways in which we might be kind of hearing a still small voice and wondering if we should respond to it. So thank you very much, Madeline. You'll be able to respond to some questions near the end of our time. For now, I would like to turn to our second panelist, Jessica Brock. Jessica is an attorney in South Bend, Indiana. She prays at the Church of Loretto with the Sisters of the Holy Cross and plays clarinet in their choir. Jessica received her BA in Sociology and Theology, her JD and her LLM in International Human Rights Law from the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I just wanted to also begin with you asking you, tell us a little bit about Loretto Zoom, which you created. How did it come to be?
Well, thanks, Colleen, and everyone for the invitation to join you. It's a privilege to be here. So the short answer to your question is that Loretto Zoom came to be by accident. I had actually traveled home to Kansas around the time that public masses stopped happening. And my mother was having knee replacement surgery, so she was in the hospital. I was at home with the dogs one Friday morning. And for reasons I will never know, I sent an email to about 15 friends saying, hey, do you want to gather to do some faith sharing or pray together in some way this Sunday, or the first Sunday that there were no public masses? And kind of like Madeline said, I had no idea if anyone would be interested in this, but people wrote back, yeah, sure, let's do something. And we eventually decided we'd meet on this thing called Zoom because one of us had an account. And for lack of an idea of what to do, since it was, you know, Friday before a Sunday, I put together a simple liturgy of the word. And in my email to friends, I guess I thought this would be like a faith sharing group. If I had to guess what I thought it would be, I really didn't think it through at all. I said, you know, this isn't meant to be exclusive, by that I thought, you know, hey, invite 1 or 2 friends or a spouse, your kids. So later that evening, I'm on the couch watching TV and I get an email where my email has been forwarded to 140 other people who prayed together at our church, the Church of Loretto, which was a big surprise. And I thought, okay, so we're doing this. And that Sunday, we ended up having about 86 different computers log in for the Liturgy of the Word. Holy Week was like the next week or 2 weeks away. So quickly put together a planning committee to make it through Holy Week, you know, ignorantly thinking that maybe we'd be done by Easter with online liturgies. And now we've had as many as 190 some computers log in. We average maybe 170 different computers, plus the whole convent for the Sisters of the Holy Cross. And the planning committee continues on. So it's become really the regular liturgy for our community as well as folks that they've invited. All unforeseen and unasked for, but also wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that must have been a bit, I don't know, surprising or unnerving. And also, you know, I think you've talked about as well how there are others who oversee kind of prayer for the community of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. And your initial invitation was not intended at all to, you know, usurp that space by any means, or take it over. It was meant to be a faith sharing group, but it turned into so much more. So I just wonder what went through your mind, and because you probably, I mean, you had a choice to say, yes, this is exactly what I meant, let's go in this direction, or no, I'm gonna go back to this group that I thought that I was creating, and you all can kind of continue on this path. So I just wonder, because I think when we come up with these things, it's very rare that they don't take on a life of their own. And how did you choose to kind of remain with it?
Well, yeah, it was a surprise. So among the 140 recipients of the forwarded email was the liturgy director for the sisters. And I immediately thought, like, uh-oh, you know, will the wrong idea be given? Because certainly if I had intended to do something like this, I would have spoken with her ahead of time to ask what she thought about it. So I guess nervousness was one feeling about how people would perceive the invitation as this was evolving in real time. But I really didn't consider that I had the option to say no. I think that I just felt such a responsibility to this community. Though I'm not a formal leader in the church, by being a musician and known in the church community, I think people respected the invitation that they received from me, and I felt, you know, this accountability to make it happen. I received so many emails from people wanting to join, and with great enthusiasm, that I felt a responsibility to try to make this happen for folks.
Yeah, and I'm privy to some of the people who have benefited a great deal from that gathering. So I think many of them are grateful for your initial invitation and your continued yes, even after it turned into something much greater and more demanding than you anticipated. What did this ask of you? Because I think also, you know, when John says kind of our lives are not our own, and this call to co-responsibility, it does ask something of us. And what did this demand to be able to do well?
Well, it did demand quite a bit, especially at first. One thing folks may want to know about our community is that the majority, I would say, are at least age 70, if not 80s and 90s. So I think one of the greatest graces and miracles of this is that they were all willing to learn how to use Zoom and to figure out if they had a webcam and how to use it. And I mean that in no negative way. It was incredible how eager and willing people were to figure all of that out, and how supportive others, family and friends and other people were to help them figure it out. We'll still hear people on the phone at the beginning of the Zoom, okay, now you click this button and you do this. So I became a Zoom. I'd never used Zoom, but I've become some kind of IT technician over time. At the time I was taking care of my mother after her surgery, and I have a full-time job. So I was working at least 40 hours a week on this project, making worship guides, recording music, responding to emails. So it demanded a lot at the beginning. But I think more profoundly, what it's required of me is to really be open and to listen. The planning committee that has been formed is wonderful, but we don't agree all the time. And so to enter into open dialogue and be free to express opinions and to talk about what would be best for everyone to create the best liturgical experience for everyone has been a challenge, but also, to receive feedback from the community, to listen to it, to respond to it, has been a challenge. And then finally, just to accept that it took me a long time to get over the fact that it was not a faith sharing group with friends, that it had become something that, was not mine and I was not in control of. And it took me a long time to accept that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your honesty about that, because I think it's not so easy to have someone take your idea and turn it into something else. But I really appreciate the way that you and those who have led it have responded, not by creating something just for yourselves, but trying to respond to the community. And I know that that's not a once and for all thing. I think both you and Madeline have both spoken of the ways in which you continue to hear feedback from those who are receiving this, and you have to pivot often and adjust based on what the needs of the community are. I wondered too, Jessica, especially in this, on the topic of kind of lower stakes gathering, lower stakes belonging that John was alluding to. Talk a little bit about how this Loretto Zoom was that for some of the people who have gathered, based on what you've heard from them.
Sure. So the majority, by far, of the people who pray together in these online liturgies are folks who would ordinarily gather to pray together at the Church of Loretto, which includes the Sisters of the Holy Cross and then a group of lay folks from the South Bend area. And our physical church is set so that we sit in the round. So we're very accustomed to seeing one another's faces. Even if I don't know your name, if I see you in the grocery store, I'll know that you sit by the baptismal font 3 over 2nd row, because that's where you sit every week. Like, that's an attribute of our community. So Zoom is very kind of familiar for us. The idea of seeing people is part of our worshiping experience. So I think for, let's say, the regulars at the Church of Loretto, this was just a natural transition of, this is how we can be together, to pray together, to see one another, to stay in community. I think for, there have been families of people who ordinarily pray at Loretto who have joined in. And I know that several of those family members aren't people who ordinarily go to Mass in non-COVID times. And I don't know what brought them in the first place, whether it was a chance to see their family, or maybe perhaps like the stories of grace. Well, my family member thinks this is a good thing, so I'll try it, and I can turn the camera off or the microphone. And so if it's not great, I'm in my sweatpants on the couch and it didn't ask that much of me. And maybe it'll turn out that this will feed me in some unexpected way. We have many professors in our community who've invited students who are seeking a way to pray. And I think it was a combination of the low stakes of being in your house, turning on your computer, and people can see you or not. And then also that, you know, we're in this time so starved for connection that at least initially, any sort of connection was better than no connection. And then it turned out that there was more there than just, you know, getting to wave at your family members.
Yeah, I think I've heard from more than one person that this time of COVID and opportunities like those presented by Loretto Zoom might be a way, a bit of a path back to being engaged in the church for many who have been disengaged and who have seemed to be okay with being disengaged. But it's a little bit harder when it doesn't require you to get in your car and drive across town. As you said, it just requires you to turn on a computer, and you can turn it off if you don't want to. But I think it's a testament to the beauty of the prayer that you all have created, that people tune in and have stayed. And that, again, I guess, how have you managed to, again, kind of guard against making it just about this group getting together in this way during this unique time, and of pointing just back to itself? How is it that we point to the source that was the original source of your own longing to gather friends in prayer? How have you maintained that so that it hasn't just become kind of another online club during this COVID time?
Well, I have the great benefit of the fact that our community, the majority of the people in the community are very intentional people. We have a surprising number of liturgists that pray at our church. So, you know, the starting point for me was I come with all of those gifts that make life easier in terms of making that happen. But, you know, having our prayer together be the liturgy of the word, which, you know, we celebrate when we gather for Eucharist as well, I think reminds us of our Eucharistic celebration. As part of our liturgy of the word, we participate in a spiritual communion. So we recognize that we can't physically receive the sacrament of the Eucharist in this time, but we remember that we are Eucharistic people, and that it's important for us to continue to gather and share the word and to share communion with one another. I think it, in the same way that my desire for connection and intimacy caused me to send an email to some friends, I would wager that for a lot of people who tuned in initially and continue to tune in, they're also seeking that desire for continued community and intimacy with one another, but also with God. And the beauty of celebrating the liturgy of the word is that it's enabled us to really focus on the word of God in a way that we might not give it attention when we're gathered for Mass. So that's been a unique opportunity for us. We've also really gone to lengths to try to make the preaching as diverse as possible, so that you know, talking about access points to grace and to the Word of God, you know, like we had a mother preach on Mother's Day, and a father preach on Father's Day, just different voices that we don't ordinarily hear breaking open the Word of God, I think have helped people find God's presence in their own lives in ways that they may not have previously had the opportunity to do so. And finally, I guess I would say that we've really, it started out kind of risky, but it's turned out to be one of the most beautiful parts of our liturgies. The prayer of the faithful we've opened up so that people type in their prayers in the chat box. And not only do you get to find out what's happening with everyone, but it's I think a way for people to open up to one another, to be vulnerable, and to say, like, this is what is happening in my life, what I need prayerful support about, what I'm trying to trust God with, and asking other people to do that with them. And I think that that's been a beautiful way of growing, not only in community, but also inviting us all to pray, not selfishly for ourselves, but for one another, and to be more aware of what's happening in lives. And we have people literally from all over the world who join us for prayer. So not only here, but in Bangladesh or Brazil or wherever, what's happening, reminding us of our belonging in a universal church, especially in a time when we're so siloed during this sheltering in place.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And I'm aware now, I know that this varies around the country. Here, Mass has begun to be celebrated again in person, which is such a gift. And so many who do gather, have gathered at the Loretto Zoom, have resumed attending Mass at a parish that they belong to, and at the same time continue to pray with this community, knowing that the sisters, because of their age and vulnerability, are not able to gather for Mass in large groups now. And so, but they do gather them for Mass in smaller groups among them. So it's been beautiful to hear people talk about the ways in which this gathering has actually helped them re-engage in the liturgy of the Eucharist in an even deeper and more meaningful way. So just thank you for all the work that you and those who are in charge of that effort continue to undertake, since it looks like it will continue, especially because the sisters are not able to open up their church for some time. Again, I just thank both of our panelists. We share their examples not because they necessarily are exactly what the needs might be where you are, but more as examples of kind of ordinary lay folks who don't consider themselves particular leaders within the church, asking questions about what needs they have and those around them have, and having the courage to kind of throw that out there, and even the courage to say yes when something that they intend to do becomes something else. So, so we just share them and thank them for their witness to co-responsibility, even if that isn't a title that you would necessarily put on your efforts. But I think that they're a great example of what we're talking about. We'd like to use the remainder of our time. We have a good 15 minutes to engage questions. So please, you can direct those questions to the chat box, and we will be able to entertain several of them. And I invite Dr. Cavadini, Jessica, and Madeline to respond to them. I believe we have our first one that comes from Annalisa. And I believe you will be unmuted so that you can ask your question aloud to us.
Thank you, Colleen. This question is for Madeline. Can you speak, Madeline, to how you created a culture of vulnerability in the Stories of Grace process, and specifically how you created that in order for that authenticity to come through? So, you know, sharing stories and giving witnesses is like a common practice, but it sounds like you did it in a way that was really effective and that was received really well. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to that and any suggestions on scaling up that culture.
That's a really wonderful question. Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind in hearing that question. So I was really lucky, I think, that I got to reimagine a new space for the Stories of Grace. So one thing I didn't mention is that all of the Notre Dame Vision mentors in faith have really excellent formation in crafting their stories of grace as part of their preparation for serving as a mentor in faith. So luckily, I sort of got to work with an existing pool of people who I knew were open to sharing a story of grace in a similar format, and who had already received great formation in crafting that story and working through that process of being so vulnerable. But one thing that surprised me as someone who shared a story both at M.Div Vision and in the Stories of Grace evening prayer is I thought it was really vulnerable to share a story of grace in front of like 400 high school students, but I actually was so much more nervous to share my story at the Getty's Hall or at the Getty's Chapel space, because I had been tasked with personally inviting my friends and classmates. And so it was a lot more intimate of a space for me to share that story. Maybe a little more comfortable since I was the one tasked with that personal invitation, but still I felt much more vulnerable in that space actually, which was surprising. But I think it was also really important too that we invited a storyteller who hadn't shared a story at Notre Dame Vision in the past. So that we had a Notre Dame faculty or staff member invited to share a story, I think invited both the audience and the storytellers to see their story in a new set. And I think that was important to creating it as a culture of belonging and not something exclusive, that this wasn't just about Notre Dame Vision mentors gathering to share a story they'd already shared, but a new space where the vulnerability looked a little bit different, and was also inviting the listeners to maybe enter into different ways of talking with that friend who was sharing the story, or the storyteller was sort of opening themselves up to their Notre Dame little pocket in a new way, which I think took courage, but there was some comfort in being in a set of storytellers too.
I recall too, Madeline, I think the setting, the fact that you gathered within the context of prayer really was conducive for people entering kind of more deeply into it rather than kind of sitting in a storytelling circle, which can be helpful but has a different feel to it.
I think it was really comforting always to close the evening in evening prayer and to speak the words of the Psalms to each other and then all be welcomed into that story. I always felt very peaceful at the end of that, even if I had been very anxious at the beginning.
That's beautiful. I love that idea of kind of stories of grace of those who have gathered in the context of the Christian story, kind of read aloud and prayed together through the Psalms. So thank you for naming that. Thank you, Annalisa, for your question. I think we have another from Sean Sutton. If you could share your question with us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was just wondering if you've had any other groups, Jessica, spin off of what you've been doing, or Madeline, as you meet in either groups on Zoom or personally. Have other people taken that and started their own groups kind of based on what you're doing?
I'm not aware of any groups spinning off. We've gathered new people from far and wide, but I'm not aware of spin-offs, but that's not to say that there aren't any.
Great, I think Mark Mann is next, and he has a question for John. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks. And actually, the question can be for all three.
Great.
But it was on reflection from what Dr. Cavadini was sharing about welcoming and hospitality. And I posed the question that it sounded, by implication, that what you were pointing to was that hospitality and welcoming is the fruit of a culture of belonging, of a fruit of fostering communion, not the means to it. But it's something that then helps generate and regenerate that culture of belonging, that would be a marked characteristic of it. And wonder, and Dr. Cavadini did reply briefly, but wonder if you want to elaborate on that. And then also for both Madeline and Jessica, in what ways did those characteristics get expressed as your, I don't want to say program, it's not a program, right? But as your groups met and gathered, how was that marked by further hospitality?
Yeah, I guess very briefly. Thanks for the question. I just think we have to guard against thinking we can create the belonging that people are looking for. Like, there's not enough belonging. I mean, the belonging that people are looking for is very, very deep ultimately, and it can only be supplied by the Lord. So I think we have to be careful not to think that our efforts make that belonging, because we can't give enough belonging to make people feel ultimately at home. But what we can do is invite people, persuade people, find contexts, like the two speakers we just heard on the panel, found ways to facilitate entry into a culture of belonging, which ultimately we don't make and we can't claim as our work, because it's all the work of grace in Jesus and through the sacraments. So it's like we do make the Eucharist in a sense, but only in the context of realizing the Eucharist makes the church. Christ in the Eucharist makes the church. And that's the only reason in a sort of derivative way we can make the Eucharist. So Christ makes the belonging in a kind of a derivative way. We can, by evangelization, bring people into it. That's all.
I'll say in our context, those of us who are not sisters who pray at the Church of Loretto have been formed by their spirituality, their great hospitality. They've taught us how to be hospitable, how to pray, and they've taught us how to be welcoming, while at the same time being authentically who we are. And so I think we try to do that in our Zoom gatherings. The password is no secret. All are welcome to join in, but we don't change the content of the liturgy of the word in hopes of getting more people to sign in. I guess I could put it that way, but we try to recognize everyone who's present, and to we greet each other at the beginning and the end, and the prayers of the faithful, do things to make it personal so that people feel seen and heard and valued while they're in community.
And I think for the Stories of Grace nights of evening prayer, I think it's interesting to think about hospitality as a fruit of that gathering, in hearing ways that our storytellers would find maybe their friend group or their study group that they invited a little more open to talking about faith if it had not maybe been a touchstone in that friend group, or hearing ways that spending time sitting and listening to someone's story of grace would then create maybe a little hospitable space to keep talking about that after that event was over. So I think I did start to see it as a fruit, and that was something beautiful to see happen.
Thank you. I think David Karen, was responding a bit to John, mentioning sometimes we can get in the way of Christ's belonging. So I don't know if that's something that you wanted to respond to, John.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Pope Francis, he warns us against the failure of institutions to be welcoming. So he names it there. And I just want to say, I complain myself. I'm a complainer. Pope Francis on Sunday told us not to complain in his homily for Saints Peter and St. Paul. So I have to remember. But they're not welcoming. They don't do this. They don't do this. So I have to think, okay, I can do it. I can supply some warmth. I can supply dimensions of. I can begin to create a culture of warmth that draws people in and that makes them realize that the sacramental communion is not, with the priest. It's not with this person that you think maybe is not very welcoming. It's with Jesus. And it's a deeper communion than anything we could create ourselves. Like I said, we can't create enough communion to satisfy people's hearts. It's only the Lord who can. So I think we have to have confidence that our efforts, that we can create culture, we can contribute to building up the communion of the church, which is the ultimate locus of belonging. I know we can get in the way, and I know we can complain about people getting in the way. I do, and shouldn't so much. I should just take that energy and put it into the way Pope Francis talks about evangelization.
Thank you, John, for that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I really appreciate the witness of Madeline and Jessica here, of the work that it takes to stay out of the way of that, the work that it takes to guard against, you know, making a club of a gathering that has as its center Christ and the Christian story, so that something like Stories of Grace doesn't just become a personal storytelling space where it's focused on the writer, or a gathering like Loretto Zoom just becomes kind of a Zoom social gathering, or a replacement for the sacramental life. I think both of you have really tried to walk delicately that line of extending warmth, but not presuming that you are creating it, but creating a space that points back to the source of our belonging, which is Christ, and taking responsibility for that as lay folks in the church. So thank you very much for your witness. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you for the ways in which you've taken up this call to co-responsibility where you are. And I hope that John's words, Jessica and Madeline's examples can also bear fruit for each of us in how we're taking up this mantle of co-responsibility and helping to create cultures of belonging, which we see in every corner of our life right now is in such desperate need. So thank you all for gathering.